I came to, I would say beyond just a superficial kind of, familiarity with, Che and Fidel Castro through, music like Rage Against the Machine and stuff like that. But I would say I came to a deeper understanding of Fidel Castro in Cuba while studying Latin American history in college. While I was inspired to some extent by Castro and the Cuban Revolution, I understood at that time the isolation of Cuba and the nature of the one-party state that limited democracy in the country. Castro has been an inspiration to revolutionaries. He overthrew the brutal dictatorship of Batista, and he opposed U.S. imperialism for, going on maybe 50 years, I would say, until he died. We as Marxists defend the right of an oppressed people to overthrow their oppressor. In addition to the nature of the revolution, we differ with other socialists on support of the one-party state that followed the revolution. I want to argue that while Castro may have had good intentions for the Cuban people, his rule was authoritarian, limited the democracy of Cuban people, and stands as another example of socialism from above. So just some contents of what I'll talk about is a background of Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, the one-party state, Draper's two souls of socialism idea, views from the left, and then some issues in Cuba today. So just a quick background of Cuba. The Taino and Guanahatabe indigenous peoples were the ones who inhabited Cuba prior to the arrival of Europeans. I guess it's important to say, well, I'll get to it in a minute, but Columbus arrives, 1492. I think after Bahamas or wherever it was, Cuba was the next island he landed on. What he brought was the, along with religion, the encomienda system, which was a feudal style forced labor system, which forced natives to work. But due to the arrival of Europeans, of course, we know that disease wiped out most indigenous. And I'll say at this point, it's important to note that while most indigenous were wiped out populations at that time, there is still indigenous blood and people who are indigenous in Cuba today. So that's important to know. With the expansion of sugarcane growth on the island, of course, we have the arrival of slavery. So enslaved Africans were brought as labor. And they also, too, even to today, make up people who were brought from Africa, make up much of the population today. Going on from there. So jumping forward then, Cuba was a colony of Spain from the time of Columbus up until the very late 1800s. So some of the first instances of Cuban independence, so fighting against the Spanish colonial powers, would be Carlos Manuel de Cespedes. He led a rebellion that was the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 78. There's another little uprising in there called the Little War. And then Jose Marti formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1890s. Jose Marti, who's pictured there on the right, was a huge influence on Castro. And he was, for Marti's ideas were around more of revolutionary nationalism, not necessarily socialism. So the Cuban War for Independence was 1895 to 1898. And in 1898, the last 3 months of the War for Independence, we see the arrival of the United States, and this was the Spanish-American War. So the U.S. appropriated the Cuban War for Independence. If you studied history, you might have read about yellow journalism and how that was used to shape public opinion around Cuban independence, and really just to sell newspapers and have, flashy headlines. U.S. capitalists only wanted to intervene in Cuba to access new markets, to take possession of colonial powers from Europe, whom it rivaled at the time. Many agree that the accidental sinking of the USS Maine was used, to blame. It was blamed on Spain, and that's what was used to push the U.S. into the war. U.S. capitalists had no interest in liberating the Cuban people. And what followed after independence showed that the U.S.'s interests were in expanding business and intervening as in Cuban politics. So U.S. intervention in the Batista dictatorship. After the Spanish-American War, Cuba became a protectorate of the United States. The U.S. reserved the right to intervene in financial and foreign affairs. They helped secure friendly governments to guard their business interests. Specifically, tourism was really big from the United States to Cuba. Fulgencio Batista was a dictator, and he led through puppets for a little over 25 years. So he was very much involved in politics from about 1933 to 1948 or so. So a little bit about Fidel Castro. He was a son of a land and business owner of Spanish descent, had a petty bourgeoisie background. I would say, and then also I should mention his younger brother, Raul Castro, who became president after Fidel, and his older brother, Ramon. There's some other siblings as well. But both Fidel and Raul became involved in politics and activism in school, and were a part of the youth anti-Batista movement that was going on in the 1950s. Fidel Castro gravitated towards revolutionary nationalism through Jose Marti, and he read some Marxism. Raul Castro, on the other hand, joined the Communist Party and was more of identified as a Marxist-Leninist in the Stalinist tradition, which the Communist Party of Cuba, leading in before the revolution, was Stalinist. Fidel and Raul became a part of the movement, as it was called, and they led an attack on the Moncada barracks. Forget the year on that, 1953 or so. And both of them, Raul and Fidel, were imprisoned along with others, and eventually they were exiled. In Mexico, Raul and Fidel meet with other Cuban exiles, as well as they meet Che Guevara, who is from Argentina. They planned an insurrection and formed the 26th of July movement, which was the name of their revolutionary organization. So the Cuban Revolution, and this is just kind of an overview. This could be a whole kickoff just on the Cuban Revolution. But 1956, Castro and 80 revolutionaries traveled to Cuba by boat. This was the 26th of July movement. Once they were in eastern Cuba, they started a guerrilla war in rural areas. They won support of local peasants and trained volunteers into their guerrilla army. They did not combine with a working class movement, which is important to note. Throughout 57 and 58, they began controlling parts of Cuba, moving westward. Batista fled, and Castro in the 26th of July movement took control over the government. There's some pretty cool pictures. Fidel Castro was a charismatic person and a powerful orator. He dressed modestly. This is after the revolution. He specifically didn't want statues of him. He usually wore these dark green military fatigues, had a gun on him. Forgot what else I was going to mention here. Oh, the picture. There was the speech he gave in January 1959, and speaks to the cult of personality that developed afterwards. Was that he gave a speech in January 1959, right after the revolution, and a dove landed on his shoulder, and another two landed on his podium, and were there for like 2 hours. Maybe it was orchestrated or something, but people had this like religious kind of feeling around Fidel, that he was this, divine type of leader. This is not that picture, as he's got a white beard, so much later. A little bit on the one-party state. After the failed US-supported Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro identified as a communist or Marxist-Leninist. Cuba began to strengthen its ties with the USSR, who it would become dependent on at times. Monolithic unity was this idea that Farber writes about, this Cuban style Stalinism, which was militarized discipline and organization, uniformity, and centralism. The one-party state depended on popular mobilization, not popular democratic control. So they required the people to be mobilized, but not necessarily in a democratic process involved in the government. Mass organizations were centered within the government. I'll mention a little bit about this later. And the other factions and parties within Cuba were criminalized. 600 ways to kill Castro. So the CIA planned around over 600 assassination attempts on Castro. Two of my favorites are when they put dynamite inside of a cigar that he was intended to smoke. And then another one, because they knew he liked to go scuba diving, they put a piece of dynamite inside of a seashell, and he was to go swim near it and it explode. He didn't die out of any of those 600 attempts. And I guess it's important to note that these started with Eisenhower and went up until Clinton, these assassination attempts. So spanning, a good 40 some years of assassination attempts. The Bay of Pigs invasion was planned by the CIA, and it's where they trained exiles, Cuban exiles, and sent, riled up exiles who didn't like the Cuban government and wanted to, take it down. So they trained and weaponized them and sent them in. And that was the Bay Pigs invasion, which failed. It was put down. This tactic, though, was repeated by the US during the Cold War throughout Latin America. There was the US-backed coup in Chile in '73, and then in Guatemala in the '50s, both presidents Arevalo and Arbenz were both, there was assassination attempts, and then Arbenz was ousted by a coup just for being more, left-leaning liberal social democrat types. With the threat of assassination, this reinforced Castro's power over Cubans, the need for tight security, persecution for those he deemed enemies of the state or of the revolution. Stalinism in the tropics. The state owns and controls so this is about Cuba. The state owns and controls the economy. Both political and non-political organization is determined by the ruling party. The central political bureaucracy functions like the owner of the state, meaning that the power is monopolized by an autocratic elite, which would be the Communist Party of Cuba. This kind of socialism from above constrains, if not outright criminalizes, the building of popular organization independent of the one-party state. The dominant method of dealing with dissidents and political difference is violent policing rather than political persuasion and argument, the latter being a necessary element if the goal is to build socialism and democracy. And those two quotes from Mike Gonzalez. Most of my quotes and notes will be from Mike Gonzalez and Samuel Farber. I'll cite references at the end, but Socialism from below. So in Gonzalez's articles, he talks about Hal Draper and the two souls of socialism. So this idea of socialism from below versus socialism from above. From below, Draper's talking about Marx's idea of the self-emancipation of the working class. By from above, he refers to totalitarian dictatorships, benevolent dictators, economic determinism, and paternalistic politics, and others. Socialism can't be given to workers by a benevolent dictator or on their behalf. This idea would be the idea of substitutionalism, of one party representing the interests of another, such as the Communist Party of Cuba representing the interests of the people or the workers. Two questions that comes from this idea of the two souls of socialism is who has the power and why the working class. So a quote on each of those. Why the working class? This is a Farber quote, but of Marx and Engels. The working class was the first exploited class in history that, because of its social and economic characteristics, could emancipate itself and avoid the restoration of class rule that typified all previous historic attempts at liberation, including the most recent bourgeois revolution. And then a quote on who has the power from Mike Gonzalez. Fidel Castro's regime is the very personification of the socialism from above tradition, a benevolent despot who governed through his personal rule and constructed a one-party state that monopolized politics, regulated socio-cultural expectations, and dominated all economic activity. A benevolent dictator. So noble acts from the top are not the same as working class organization. Union leadership, women's groups, and more were controlled by the Communist Party. There was cultural repression and social control. Blacks couldn't and can't independently organize or form their own organizations to make demands. The Castro regime attacked and banned gay artists and intellectuals from influence abroad, and they were persecuted. The government controlled the import of literature, music, and entertainment, seized the press, monopolized media outlets, and censored historical facts and critical ideas within Cuba. Here's a quote from Samuel Farber. The problem is not that the present Cuban system is imperfect, but that its very bureaucratic nature worsens people's living conditions and creates oppressive barriers to what people can do collectively and individually. Moreover, the government does not even try to rectify, let alone abandon its dictatorial institutions and practices. In fact, the regime usually moves in the opposite direction and institutes reforms designed to ensure the permanence of the existing system. Therefore, the real issue is whether people in Cuba have the right to freely organize themselves to address the problems affecting their society. The only way in which they can organize, or the only way in which they can effectively and productively do so, is when they have actual control over their social, political, and economic destiny. Thus, a people's democratic control over its own fate is not just a good thing in itself, but also the most practical way by which people are likely to care and attempt to solve the problems affecting them. Some views from the left. Some leftists try to justify Cuba's dictatorial rule, campists, Stalinists, Maoists, etc. They see Cuba as a highly progressive system due to its advances in education and health and its support for the poor. Some see it as anti-imperialist and opposing the United States, and this is where we get the idea of campism. If Cuba is opposed to US imperialism, The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I support Cuba because they oppose U.S. imperialism. Castro's, and then also this idea that Castro spoke for the interests of the people, which, you know, I would say is just kind of the definition of what substitutionalism is. And some that would criticize those who criticize Cuba, saying that it is being dismissive of the global South. In what I would say is, as Marxists, we use a historical materialist lens to analyze every revolutionary situation and look at, you know, and I guess look at the whole situation and compare these together. Political clarity. I have a quote from Gonzalez, dissecting Fidel Castro and the consequences of the Cuban Revolution, relying on the Hal Draper's analysis, not only eased my transition, but reminded me of the importance of a key Leninist principle. A workers' movement needs a clear revolutionary program and a cohesive organization, not one dependent on a conspiratorial elite, whether from the bourgeoisie or from a small band of guerrilla fighters. And then I also have another note too, that Farber reminds us that revolutions do not automatically lead either to dictatorships or democracy. Their outcome will depend on the leading politics of the movement. So revolutions can go any which way, but it all depends on the politics that are leading that revolution that will develop the character of that afterwards. In Farber's chapter from his book, he talks about Marx and Engels, and I'll just read. Previous bourgeois revolutions were considered progressive. These were progressive to the extent that it struggled to abolish the many reactionary features of feudalism. So this is Marx and Engels writing this. The bourgeoisie remained true to itself only when it consistently demanded direct universal suffrage, freedom of the press, organization and assembly, and abolition of all discriminatory laws against particular classes of the population. Marx would support a bourgeois revolution to the extent that it unifies workers and creates a new starting point for the working class. They would next have to oppose the bourgeoisie. In the context of what Marx was writing about was Otto von Bismarck trying to unify Germany, which was positive because it unified German workers. But Marx argued that after that, unifying of workers and creating of that movement, they next had to take down Otto von Bismarck because he was a fucking dictator. Simón Bolívar, another bourgeois revolutionary, the great liberator of South America, was criticized by Marx at the time because he leaned towards military dictatorship and authoritarianism. So this kind of connects with what I was talking about, using a material analysis to look at different revolutionary situations. I wanted to mention the Mariel Boatlift, which was in 1980. Cubans who opposed Castro's regime protested outside of the Peruvian embassy. This led to pressure from the international community to release refugees. Many of the LGBTQ plus, many LGBTQ plus peoples, I should say, were persecuted, and many of them went to that embassy. So US boats arrived, and Castro, along with many of the people who were at the embassy, also emptied out the prisons and mental health facilities and sent them on those boats into the United States. And if you're familiar with the movie Scarface, that's his origin. Castro wanted to remove, and this is even into the 1980s, wanted to remove those who he considered undesirable for the revolution from Cuba. A comrade sent me an article about a week ago, which is cool because it was a Samuel Farber article, just a recent one about Cuba. forget the title off the top of my head, but in it, he talks about protests in Cuba in 2021. So due to conditions from the pandemic and the Hurricane Ian, there was power outages, food shortages. This led to a lot of protests. Also, the economy hasn't been doing well in Cuba due to tourism dropping. And even despite that, they're still building hotels now in hopes that they can revitalize that industry. I'll get into remittance in a minute. To talk more about this idea that Farber discusses, the Rentier State. So he's talking about extractivist economies such as oil-rich countries like in the Middle East. These are countries with lack of economic diversification. A Cuban planter once said, "Without sugar, there is no country." So Cuba was known as being a big sugar harvester and exporter. The revolution rebelled against rentierism and implemented agrarian reform, in that agriculture with social justice and rapid industrialization was what the reform was, what they were intending to do. Lack of experience and pressure from the USSR led to Cuba focusing on sugar. There was some mechanization of the sugar industry, but land was overexploited, erosion, salinity, high acidity. Cuba received subsidies from the USSR and became a rentier state, in that they were focusing on sugar. In the 1990s, there was a crisis due to the USSR collapsing or falling apart in 1989 or so. Who was their big trading partner and who they had become dependent on. The government extracted, as a result of this, the government extracted more work from workers, and there was exploitation of workers and peasants. So this led to migratory waves and refugees, people trying to leave the country. Younger and potentially more productive people are leaving at the time of this article, which was recently, with growing proportion of retirees. So it's throwing off this balance of there's not this young workforce. And a big part of their economy is very much dependent on Cubans who are abroad sending remittances. So sending money back home to their family is something that they've become dependent on. The government is not investing enough for a sustainable economy, and it's not improving standards of living for people. And also, too, as I mentioned, foreign-owned hotels, an industry they've been building up, which is strangely similar to the situation to that of 1950s pre-revolutionary Cuba, where they very much were dependent on hotels and focusing on sugar and under dictatorial rule. So kind of an interesting cyclical kind of movement. Farber writes that the Cuban government has great power, but no responsibility to the people. On the right is Raul Castro, the recent former president. So it was Fidel ruled Cuba, or led Cuba, I should say, from the 1959 up until 2006, when Raul took over, up until past couple years, and the new president is Miguel Diaz-Canel on the left. So on the left is Canel, the right is Raul Castro. Canel is the new president. So, however, much more important than the US blockade as a cause of Cuba's problems is the very nature of the economic system that prevails on the island. It promotes indifference, apathy, lack of responsibility and incentives, whether economic or political, as could be the democratic control of the workers and the nation in general, especially in the predominant state sector of the economy. The lack of incentives and apathy are reflected in the fact that only 55% of Cubans of working age are part of the labor force, one of the lowest rates in Latin America. There's a quote from Samuel Farber. And here's some of the articles I use. So a couple articles by Mike Gonzalez and an article by Samuel Farber, but also I highly recommend, in addition to all those articles, this book. I didn't get to finish it, but it's called Cuba, since the revolution in 1959. Samuel Farber. It's a Haymarket Books book. Check it out if you're interested in more about this. But that's all for me.